The air felt like fire that day, but it wasn't the heat that made my blood boil. It was Karen Sloan, standing across the street with her phone out, snapping photos of my driveway like she was building a case for the FBI. I just finished restocking the cooler, ice-cold water bottles I'd been giving out to joggers, delivery drivers, anyone desperate enough to brave the triple-digit heat. The handwritten sign next to it read, "Stay cool. Take one for free." I thought it was the most harmless thing in the world. To her, it was a crime. She was the HOA president, self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, and she ruled with the kind of petty precision that made people triple measure their lawn height before mowing. I'd seen her shut down kids' lemonade stands, issue fines for unsightly holiday wreaths, and now, apparently, even cold water in a heat wave was a threat to community standards. The next morning, I found the envelope in my mailbox, a $650 fine for unauthorized signage and unapproved structures. A fine for kindness. That was the moment I stopped thinking of her as just another neighbor with too much time on her hands, and started thinking about how to beat her at her own game. She thought the bylaws made her untouchable. What she didn't know was that I'd been reading them too. And I just found something buried in those pages that would turn this entire fight around and make Karen wish she'd never taken that first picture. Have you ever had a neighbor go after you for something ridiculous? Tell me your story in the comments. I read everyone. And stick around, because if you've ever dealt with a Karen like this, you're going to love how it ends. Karen Sloan had been a thorn in my side since the day I moved into Willow Creek. She was the kind of neighbor who acted like the HOA was her personal kingdom. She'd strut down the sidewalk with a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other, ready to snap a picture of any violation before you had a chance to blink. It started small, a warning about my recycling bin sitting out overnight, then a letter about my truck being parked at an improper angle in my own driveway. I let those go. You pick your battles in life, and some things just aren't worth the stress. But with Karen, it was never about the rule itself. It was about control. And every time you gave her an inch, she'd take another mile. Then came the heat wave. The kind that makes news anchors talk about dangerously high heat indexes and record-breaking temperatures. The kind where you see paramedics rushing into neighborhoods, checking on seniors who haven't answered their doors. I'd spent years as a firefighter. I knew what this kind of heat could do to a body. You don't mess around with it. That's why I started putting out the cooler. Ice, bottled water, a simple cardboard sign. It wasn't about making a statement. It was about making sure someone walking their dog or delivering packages didn't end up on the sidewalk with heat stroke. And for a few days, it worked like magic. Joggers would stop and chug half a bottle right there. Delivery drivers would grab one with a wave and a smile. One afternoon, I watched a dad push a stroller up the street, grab a bottle, and pour half of it into a sippy cup for his daughter before drinking the rest himself. That right there, that's why I did it. But across the street, Karen was watching. Always watching. Her blinds would tilt just enough for me to catch the glint of her glasses. She'd shuffle outside now and then, pretending to check her mailbox, phone in hand, pretending she wasn't aiming the camera right at me. And then came the day she stood right on her front porch, aiming her phone like it was a weapon, taking picture after picture while muttering into her Bluetooth headset. The next morning, I found the envelope in my mailbox. It was a violation notice dressed up in fancy HOA legal language, but the bottom line was simple. Remove the cooler and sign immediately or pay a $650 fine. And if I didn't, they'd tack on additional penalties until it hit $50,000. And they made sure to remind me that if the fines got high enough, they could put a lien on my home. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about community standards or neighborhood aesthetics. It was about Karen flexing her power because she didn't like the idea of me doing something that wasn't under her control. I'd seen this before. People who think rules exist to serve them and them alone. And the thing is, I knew her type well enough to know that she believed she'd already won. What she didn't realize was that I'd been quietly collecting my own file over the years. Every overreaching letter, every petty warning, every time she'd bent the rules for herself. And in those HOA bylaws she loved to quote, I found something she'd never expect me to use. The cooler was staying right where it was. And if she wanted to fight over it, she'd get one. I didn't have to wait long for the first warning to turn into something bigger. The morning after I got the $650 fine notice, I stepped outside with my coffee and found Karen already at it. She was strutting down the sidewalk in her usual power walk, wearing a visor, oversized sunglasses, and that smug expression that said she'd just added another win to her mental scoreboard. In one hand, she carried her clipboard. In the other, her phone, the weapon she used to document every petty grievance in our neighborhood. She slowed her pace as she passed my driveway, glancing at the cooler like it was a pile of rotting garbage. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. How dare he defy me? She didn't say a word, but the way she lingered, long enough for the ice in the cooler to melt a little more under the morning sun, was enough to make her point. I gave her a nod, calm and polite. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me rattled, but I knew this was the opening move in what she thought would be a quick checkmate. By that afternoon, I got the first follow-up letter. This one wasn't from the HOA in general. It was signed by Karen herself as HOA president. It used the same legal-sounding language, but the tone was sharper, more personal. She accused me of blatantly ignoring direct HOA instruction, creating an unsightly obstruction, and, my favorite, operating an unapproved distribution point. You'd think I was running a black market water cartel, not giving out bottles to overheated joggers. She gave me 48 hours to remove the cooler or face immediate legal escalation. I laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that doesn't come from humor. It came from knowing that she was escalating fast, and that meant she was scared of losing control. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cold beer, spreading out the letters I'd received from her over the years. One was about the garden hose I'd left coiled in the driveway for an unacceptable duration of time. Another was about the small American flag I'd planted near my mailbox for Memorial Day. Apparently, it wasn't in compliance with flag display guidelines. Every letter was written with the same smug precision. But here's the thing. The more she wrote, the more she revealed about herself. And somewhere between those pages of legal threats and bylaw citations, I had noticed something interesting. The HOA rules didn't just apply to me. They applied to her too. And Karen, despite her obsession with rules, was a serial rule breaker when it came to her own property. She'd built an oversized shed in her backyard without HOA approval. She regularly parked her RV. Yes, she owned a full-sized RV, behind a flimsy tarp in direct violation of storage rules. She had a landscaping setup that technically counted as decorative modifications, but she'd never filed the required forms. She'd gotten away with it because no one ever dared to challenge her. Until now. The next day, I refilled the cooler and added something new, a small laminated sheet taped to the sign. It read, "In memory of those lost to heat-related illness." I wasn't just handing out water anymore. I was making it impossible for her to argue without looking like she was against basic human decency. By mid-morning, Karen was back on her porch. This time, she had backup, another board member named Linda, who looked like she'd been pulled straight out of an HOA recruitment flyer. Pastel cardigan, pearls, a permanent tight-lipped smile. They stood together, arms folded, watching as a UPS driver pulled over, grabbed a bottle, and gave me a thumbs up. Karen stormed across the street, heels clicking like gunshots on the pavement. "Tom," she began, her voice dripping with false civility, "we've already notified you of the violation." "I got your letter," I said, keeping my tone even. "Then why is this still here?" She gestured at the cooler like it was a pile of radioactive waste. "Because it's not coming down," I said. "It's a public safety measure during an extreme heat event." "This is private property," she snapped. "Community property standards apply to everyone. You don't get special privileges just because you think you're doing something noble." I leaned back against my truck and folded my arms. "And you don't get to use the rules as a weapon just because you don't like me." That hit a nerve. Her face tightened, and Linda shifted uncomfortably beside her. Without another word, Karen spun on her heel and marched back to her porch, muttering something into her phone. I knew she was calling the HOA attorney. By that evening, I had a new letter, this one delivered by certified mail. It was an official final notice of violation with an attached invoice for $650, payable within 15 days. At the bottom, in bold, It warned that failure to comply will result in further fines and potential property lien placement. I could have caved right there. Most people would have. The thought of a lien on your home is enough to make even the stubborn think twice. But here's the thing. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I had neighbors come up to me in the past week telling me about how Karen had gone after them for things just as petty. A slightly faded patio umbrella, a kid's place in a side yard, a lawn ornament she deemed unsightly. She'd been bullying this neighborhood for years, hiding behind the bylaws. And now she'd finally picked a fight with someone who knew how to read them. I called a lawyer friend of mine that night, told him I needed a crash course in HOA defense, and I needed it fast. We went over the documents line by line. The violations they were citing, they didn't hold up under the HOA's own bylaws, especially since the cooler wasn't a permanent fixture and wasn't blocking any walkways or easements. But the best part? Buried deep in the bylaws was a clause about temporary community installations for health and safety. It was vague, but it was there, and it applied to all residents. I had every right to argue that my cooler fell under that clause. And if we went to court, I'd have evidence on my side, from medical professionals to city heat advisories. The next morning, I put the cooler out again, filled to the brim with ice and water. But this time, I taped a copy of the city's extreme heat warning right to the front. Underneath it, in smaller print, I added, in compliance with HOA Bylaw Section 22.4, temporary installations for health and safety. By noon, Karen was back outside, phone in hand, pacing the edge of her driveway. She didn't cross the street this time. She didn't have to. She knew I'd called her bluff. But she wasn't done. People like Karen never just walk away. And as I'd soon find out, the harassment was only just getting started. The thing about people like Karen is that they don't stop when you stand up to them. They double down. And that's exactly what she did. By the following week, it was like she declared a one-woman neighborhood patrol. I'd see her 3, sometimes 4 times a day, cruising slowly past my house in her white Lexus SUV, phone in one hand, pretending to check her mirrors while clearly taking pictures. She'd pause just long enough to snap the cooler, my driveway, even my front porch. Sometimes she'd stop entirely, pretending to adjust something in her car, when in reality, she was just logging another infraction for her little collection. At first, I ignored it. I'd been in enough tense situations in my life. Firefighting will teach you patience. But ignoring her didn't make her go away. It only made her bolder. It started with another letter. This one listing new violations. My garbage bin was improperly stored behind my side gate. The hose reel on the side of the house was faded and unsightly, and my truck's rear tire extended beyond the paved portion of the driveway by 4.5 inches. Yes, she measured. Then came the social media campaign. Someone sent me screenshots from the Willow Creek Neighborhood Watch Facebook group. Karen had posted a blurry picture of the cooler with a caption, "Some residents think the rules don't apply to them. This is why property values decline." That thread exploded. Half the people were cheering her on, claiming rules are rules, while the other half tore into her for being petty in the middle of a dangerous heat wave. One comment from a neighbor, James, stuck with me. I watched Tom give a bottle of water to a UPS driver who looked like he was about to pass out. If that's a crime, then we need new rules. That post got over 80 likes, and you could tell it rattled her. She started responding to every supportive comment with long, defensive paragraphs about aesthetic integrity and community cohesion. But even that wasn't enough for her. One Tuesday afternoon, I caught her standing at the edge of my driveway while I was in the garage. She was holding a tape measure, literally measuring the placement of the cooler in relation to the sidewalk. When she saw me watching, she didn't flinch. She just jotted something on her clipboard, gave me a tight smile, and walked off. The next day, I got another certified letter, this one accusing me of harassment for confronting her while she was performing her duties as HOA president. Duties? Measuring my cooler like she was mapping a crime scene? And she still wasn't done. A week later, I came home to find a bright orange tag on my front door. It was a notice of safety concern, something I'd never even seen before. According to the note, the cooler presented a tripping hazard and potential contamination risk to residents. At the bottom, in fine print, it warned that the HOA had the right to remove hazards without notice. That night, I locked the cooler in the garage just in case she got any ideas. And sure enough, the very next morning, security camera footage showed her walking down the street at 6:14 a.m., phone in one hand, a set of gardening gloves in the other. She stopped at the edge of my driveway, looked around, and, finding no cooler, actually looked disappointed. But here's the thing about Karen's kind of harassment. It has a way of uniting people against her. I started getting quiet knocks at my door from neighbors. Maria from 2 houses over brought me a fresh case of bottled water and whispered, "Don't let her win." Another neighbor, John, offered to store the cooler in his garage and will out for me when I wasn't home. James, the one from Facebook, offered to testify if things went to court. It wasn't just support, though. People were starting to share their own Karen horror stories. A woman down the street told me about how she'd been fined for leaving a pair of gardening gloves on her porch overnight. Another family had gotten a warning for having unapproved holiday decorations, a pair of small pumpkins on their doorstep in October. And one guy even showed me a letter Karen had sent him for a loud vehicle operation after he'd started his motorcycle at 7 a.m. to get to work. The more I heard, the more I realized this wasn't just about me or cooler. This was about an entire neighborhood living under the thumb of one petty, power-hungry person who thought the HOA was her personal army. And then Karen went too far. It was a Saturday afternoon, 103 degrees, and I was in the front yard talking to Maria when a FedEx truck pulled up. The driver was drenched in sweat, his shirt plastered to his back. I offered him a water bottle, not from the cooler which was locked in my garage, but from my own fridge inside. He took it with a grateful nod and leaned against his truck for a moment to drink. That's when Karen came marching down the street. "Excuse me," she called out, waving her clipboard like a traffic cop. "You can't distribute food or beverages to non-residents without HOA approval." The driver looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "It's water," he said. "Doesn't matter," she snapped. "It's against the rules." I stepped forward. "Show me where in the bylaws it says that." She tightened her lips. "I don't need to show you. I am the bylaws." That line, that smug, arrogant line, would come back to haunt her. By the following Monday, I'd had enough. I gathered every letter, every screenshot, every piece of footage, and I sent it all to my lawyer friend. I told him I was ready to go to war. And in the meantime, I quietly began my own little investigation into Karen Sloan, because if she wanted to play the rules game, I was going to make sure she followed every single one of them. The harassment phase was over. Now, it was about to turn into something much bigger. It's one thing to have a feud with a neighbor. It's another to watch an entire neighborhood pick sides like it's some kind of suburban civil war. Word about my standoff with Karen spread faster than I could have imagined. It started with the Facebook group, but by week 2, it had spilled on in next-door neighborhood text chains and even the little park bulletin board near the community pool. Everyone had an opinion, and no one was shy about sharing it. On one side, you had the rule keepers. These were the people who lived and died by the HOA handbook, the ones who believed that a community's beauty came from its strict adherence to the standards. They were loud, they were organized, and they saw Karen as their champion, the one woman standing between Willow Creek and the chaos of personal freedom. They'd comment on posts with things like, "If you can't follow the rules, move somewhere without an HOA." On the other side, you had the realists. These were the neighbors who'd felt Karen's wrath and were tired of tiptoeing around their own yards. They saw the cooler for what it was, a simple act of kindness during a dangerous heat wave. And they saw her campaign against it as proof she'd lost all perspective. I started noticing little signs of where people stood. The rule keepers would walk past my house without a glance, stiff as boards, clutching their dogs' leashes like the air itself might incriminate them. The realists, though, they'd give me a nod, sometimes even a quiet thumbs up when Karen wasn't looking. But the real fracture came when a local news crew showed up. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was refilling the cooler. Yes, it was back out again, when a white van with a TV station logo pulled up. Out stepped a young reporter and a cameraman, looking for the man in the water bottle dispute. Turns out, Maria had tipped them off after Karen's latest Facebook post, and they were there to get both sides of the story. I didn't hold back. I told them about the heat wave, my years as a firefighter, and how giving water to strangers wasn't just neighborly. It could save lives. I told them about the fine, the letters, the tape measure incident. They filmed me handing water to a mail carrier and even caught a passing jogger stopping for a drink. Then they crossed the street. Karen was ready, dressed like she was running for political office, hair perfectly sprayed, blouse crisp, clipboard in hand. She didn't just give an interview. She gave a speech. "It's not about the water," she said into the camera. "It's about respecting the rules we all agreed to when we moved here. If one person decides they can ignore them, where does it stop?" The reporter pressed her, "But it's 103 degrees, and people could get heat stroke. Do you think an exception should be made?" Karen's smile tightened. "The rules exist for a reason. If we start bending them for one person's idea of kindness, we set a dangerous precedent." Dangerous precedent. That was a soundbite they used that night on the 6 o'clock news. And it did not go over the way she thought it would. The next day, the cooler was busier than ever. Delivery drivers I'd never seen before were pulling over just to grab a bottle. Joggers ran by, waving. And a few brave souls from the rule keeper side quietly admitted that, yeah, maybe she'd gone a little too far. But Karen? She doubled down. She started holding HOA neighborhood watch walks. Basically, her and a small posse of clipboard-carrying loyalists strolling the streets in pairs, writing down concerns. They'd slow down in front of my house, jot something, whisper, move on. Sometimes I'd catch her looking toward my backyard, where the top of her illegal RV was just barely visible above the fence. Oh, I noticed, and I was saving that little detail for later. Then she tried to turn the tide with a petition. A formal document demanding that the HOA adopt a no public distributions rule, citing safety and aesthetic harmony. She went door to door, collecting signatures. At some houses, she stayed for nearly half an hour, leaning on fences, nodding sympathetically as she spun her story. But here's the thing. For every person who signed, 2 others texted me to say she'd been there, and that they'd refused. Maria even followed her at a distance one afternoon, counting the houses she skipped entirely. Mostly the ones with American flags in their yards. She noticed. And then came the confrontation that blew everything open. It was a Friday evening, the sun just starting to dip, and I was sitting in a lawn chair in the driveway, cooler next to me. A small group of neighbors had gathered. Maria, James, a couple from down the street, just chatting, watching the kids ride their bikes. Karen arrived with her clipboard crew. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "This has gone on long enough," she announced, planting herself at the edge of my driveway. "You are in direct violation of HOA policy, and you are making a mockery of our community." I set my drink down. "You mean your community, Karen? Because the people here don't seem to have a problem with this cooler." "Rules are rules," she snapped. "Then why don't you follow them?" I asked, loud enough for the group and the kids to hear. Her jaw tightened. "Excuse me? That RV behind your fence," I said. HOA Section 9.2. No recreational vehicles may be stored on property unless fully enclosed in a structure. Yours is under a tarp. A tarp isn't a structure. The crowd shifted. Maria hid a smirk. Karen's face flushed, but she recovered fast. "This isn't about me. It's exactly about you," I said. "You want to enforce the rules? Start with your own backyard." She opened her mouth, then shut it again. Without another word, she spun around and walked away, clipboard clutched like a lifeline. That moment changed everything. Word about the RV spread like wildfire. By Saturday morning, it was the top topic in the Facebook group. The realists had a new rallying cry. If Karen can break the rules, so can we. The rule keepers were suddenly quieter, some even switching sides. By the end of the weekend, I'd heard from 5 different neighbors who wanted to challenge the HOA on various issues, from fence heights to holiday lights. And every single one of them was willing to back me if this went to court. Karen had spent years making herself untouchable. But now, she'd given the neighborhood a reason to look closer. And once people start looking, they find things. The cooler was still there. The heat wave was still raging. But now, the fight wasn't just mine anymore. The community had split wide open, and the next round was going to be fought in a place where Karen didn't get to control the rules, a courtroom. The day of the hearing, the air in Willow Creek was thick, not from the heat this time, but from the anticipation. You could feel it in the way neighbors lingered on their porches as I loaded a file box into my truck. You could see in the Facebook post that morning, "Good luck, Tom. Give her hell." And from the other side, "Hope the HOA shuts this nonsense down." This wasn't a full-blown trial. Not yet. It was an HOA arbitration hearing at the county courthouse, the step before an actual lawsuit. But for Karen, it was a chance to flex her power in front of an official audience. And for me, it was a chance to finally get her under oath, where her words would have consequences. When I walked into the hearing room, she was already there. Hair perfect, blouse crisp, her ever-present clipboard stacked with color-coded tabs. Beside her sat the HOA's attorney, a thin man in a gray suit who looked like he'd been carved from a block of marble. He didn't look at me when I walked past. He didn't have to. His posture alone said he thought this was going to be easy. My lawyer friend, Mike, had warned me about this. "They'll come in confident. Overconfident. That's where we win," he'd said. The hearing officer, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone, called us to order. "We're here to address the alleged violations by Mr. Tom Carter regarding unauthorized signage and placement of unapproved structures," she began. "Let's keep this civil." Karen wasted no time. The attorney started outlining the case like it was a slam dunk. The HOA had bylaws. I had violated them. End of story. He held up glossy color photos, the cooler, the sign, even one shot of me talking to a delivery driver. He made it sound like I was running a rogue operation out of my driveway. Then Karen took the stand. If you've never seen someone lie while trying to look noble, it's a sight to behold. She spoke slowly, carefully, like each word had been rehearsed in the mirror. "This isn't personal," she said, her voice honeyed. "It's about fairness. We all agreed to the rules when we moved into Willow Creek. I don't get to make exceptions, even when I might want to." I almost laughed at that last part. Then she pivoted to the danger angle. "What if one of those bottles was tampered with?" she said. "What if a child got sick? The HOA will be liable. We have to think about the safety of the community." The attorney nodded gravely, as if this were some massive public health crisis. When it was my turn, Mike stood and began with the basics. My years as a firefighter, the city's extreme heat warnings, the documented cases of heat stroke in our area during that very week. He put the laminated safety clause from the HOA bylaws on the projector. Section 22.4, temporary installations for health and safety. Then he dropped the evidence. First, a sworn statement from the paramedic who'd stopped by for a water bottle and later treated a jogger just 2 blocks away for heat exhaustion. Then, a letter from a local doctor about the importance of hydration in extreme heat. Finally, the kicker, a short video clip from my security camera showing me handing a water bottle to the FedEx driver on that 103-degree day. The driver's face was red, his hands shaking slightly, his relief obvious as he drank. "Does this look like a danger to the community?" Mike asked, turning to the hearing officer. Karen shifted in her seat, and then came the part I'd been waiting for. Mike called me back up, but instead of asking me questions about the cooler, he changed direction. "Mr. Carter, can you explain what you've observed in the backyard of the HOA president's property?" Karen's head snapped toward him. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice calm. "From my second-story window, I can see a recreational vehicle, a full-sized RV, stored behind a fence, covered only by a tarp." Mike nodded and clicked to the next slide on the projector, a high-resolution photo taken from a neighbor's yard. The RV loomed large, the tarp faded and flapping at the edges. According to HOA Section 9.2, Mike said, recreational vehicles must be stored in a fully enclosed structure, not under a tarp. Is that correct? The hearing officer adjusted her glasses. That is correct. Has the HOA president been cited for this violation? Mike asked. Silence. Karen's attorney shifted uncomfortably. That is not relevant to the current matter. Oh, it's relevant, Mike said, his voice cool. Because it demonstrates selective enforcement of the bylaws, one of the clearest indicators of bias in HOA governance. My client is being targeted for an alleged violation, while the president herself is an ongoing, documented violation. The room was dead quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Karen tried to recover. That RV belongs to my brother. Mike cut in. Does the bylaw make exceptions for ownership, or is it about storage on the property? The hearing officer raised a hand. It's about storage. Karen's mouth closed. From there, the momentum shifted entirely. Mike walked the hearing officer through each letter I'd received from Karen over the years, highlighting how minor the violations were and how they all came after I disagreed with her on HOA matters. He pointed out the Facebook posts, the public shaming, the petition she'd tried to circulate. By the time he was done, the attorney for the HOA looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. When the hearing officer spoke again, her tone had changed. It appears to me that Mr. Carter's cooler falls within the safety clause of the bylaws, particularly given the extreme heat advisories during this period. Furthermore, I have concerns about consistent application of the rules. I will be reviewing this matter further. Karen tried to interject, but the officer shut her down with a single glance. The decision wouldn't be final until it was issued in writing, but I could tell. I'd won the room, and Karen knew it. As we packed up, she leaned over just close enough for me to hear. "You think this is over?" she hissed. I looked her in the eye and smiled. "No, I think it's just beginning." 2 weeks after the hearing, the decision finally arrived. The envelope was heavier than expected, the kind of crisp, cream-colored paper that already told you it was official before you even opened it. I sat at my kitchen table with the blinds drawn, the air conditioner humming faintly in the background, and for a long moment I just turned it over my hands, feeling the embossed seal under my fingertips, thinking about how much of my life had been consumed by this ridiculous, exhausting battle. Then I broke the seal. The letter began with the standard formalities: case number, date of the hearing, the names of both parties, but it didn't take long to get to the part that mattered. After review of all evidence presented, the hearing officer finds that Mr. Carter's temporary cooler installation, placed during a period of extreme heat, falls within the scope of HOA Bylaw Section 22.4, Temporary Installations for Health and Safety. The violation notice is hereby dismissed, all fines are rescinded, and no further enforcement action shall be taken on this matter. I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hands rested on the paper for a few seconds, and I read the words again just to be sure. Dismissed. Rescinded. No further action. But the letter didn't end there. In a move I hadn't dared to hope for, the hearing officer had added a recommendation, one that wasn't binding, but was as close to a public slap in the face as Karen was likely to get without an actual censure. The board is reminded that enforcement of community bylaws must be consistent, impartial, and free from any appearance of selective application. Instances of potential noncompliance by any member of the board should be addressed promptly to preserve the integrity of the association. That was it. She'd been called out, in writing, by an official authority. And I knew that letter wasn't just going to sit quietly in a filing cabinet. I'll make sure of that. I called Maria first. She came over within the hour, bringing a bottle of champagne she'd clearly been saving for this exact moment. We sat on the porch in the fading afternoon light, sipping from mismatched coffee mugs because I'd never been much for keeping wine glasses around, and we talked about how quickly the neighborhood had changed in just a few weeks. Where once people had crossed the street to avoid being seen talking to me, now they stopped to ask questions, to share their own HOA horror stories, to suggest changes they'd like to see in the community. And that's when she told me the rumor. Apparently, the RV wasn't the only skeleton in Karen's backyard, or her front yard for that matter. According to one of Maria's friends, who'd once served briefly on the HOA board before quitting in disgust, Karen had been quietly waiving certain fees for a small circle of her friends. Landscaping fines, late payments on HOA dues, even approval fees for certain renovations, all forgiven with a stroke of her pen. No official record of the waivers existed in the public minutes, but the friend swore she'd seen them in private correspondence. It was exactly the kind of hypocrisy I'd suspected but hadn't been able to prove. Now I had a lead. I didn't rush it. Instead, I started asking casual questions at the mailbox, during walks, even in that Facebook group she'd once weaponized against me. "Hey, has anyone here ever had a fine waived by the HOA?" I'd ask, as though it was just a passing curiosity. At first, people hesitated, unsure if they could trust me. But after the hearing, after the cooler victory, the walls had come down. It didn't take long before I had 4 separate residents telling me the same story in different forms. One had been cited for repainting their shutters without approval. Fine waived after a chat with Karen. Another had left their trash cans out for 3 days. Waived. A third had replaced their fence with a design not technically allowed under the bylaws. Waived. And each time, the recipient of this generosity had been someone who, coincidentally, was either a close friend of Karen's or someone who'd publicly backed her in past disputes. I wrote it all down, every date, every detail, every conversation. I knew this was the kind of thing you had to present cleanly if you wanted it to stick. Meanwhile, the neighborhood mood was shifting in ways that were impossible for Karen to ignore. She used to hold court during HOA meetings, speaking at length while the rest of the board nodded along. But now she was met with pointed questions, long silences, and the occasional eye roll from residents who'd once been too intimidated to push back. The meetings, once sparsely attended, were suddenly standing room only. People came not just to complain, but to demand accountability. And the RV? Oh, the RV had become a legend. Photos circulated regularly in group chats and on Facebook, always accompanied by a sarcastic caption about community aesthetics. Someone even made a meme, a split image of my cooler on one side and her tarp-covered RV on the other, with the caption, "One is a violation. The other is fine. Guess which is which?" The pressure was building, and Karen could feel it. That's when she made her mistake. In a move that can only be described as pure desperation, she sent out a community-wide email late one Friday night, the kind of poorly thought-out message you'd expect from someone who'd been stewing over their loss all week. In it, she accused certain residents of conducting a smear campaign against the HOA, of harassing board members, and of spreading misinformation about enforcement practices. She didn't name me directly, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew who she meant. What she didn't realize was that in her frustration, she'd let something slip. Buried halfway through the email, she wrote, "We cannot be expected to enforce every bylaw on every property, especially when the homeowner in question had a history of cooperation and contributions to the community." That sentence was dynamite, because it was essentially an admission of selective enforcement, and not just against me, but as a general practice. Maria spotted it first. "You need to save this," she said, texting me a screenshot at 11:42 p.m., "and then you need to send it to someone who can actually do something about it." By Monday morning, copies of that email had made their way into the hands of several residents, 2 former board members, and, most importantly, the HOA's legal counsel. Not the attorney Karen had brought to the hearing, but the one retained to advise the entire association. It was the beginning of something bigger than a fight over water bottles. That afternoon, as I stood in my driveway with the cooler, now a symbol of quiet defiance that neighbors waved at as they passed, I saw her across the street, pacing her porch, phone to her ear. Her gestures were sharp, her voice rising, though I couldn't make out the words. And then, almost as if sensing my gaze, she turned to look directly at me. For a moment, her expression was unreadable. Not the smug satisfaction I'd grown used to, not even the tight-lipped annoyance she'd worn during the hearing. It was something else. It was the look of someone who realized the balance of power had shifted, and there was no getting it back. I didn't say a word. I just tipped my coffee mug in her direction, turned, and walked back inside, the cooler's lid snapping shut behind me. Because now, the fight wasn't just about whether my cooler could stay. It was about whether she could. By the time the HOA board meeting rolled around, the tension in Willow Creek was thick enough to choke on. For years, these meetings had been predictable, poorly attended affairs. A handful of residents scattered in folding chairs, Karen at the head of the table, and the rest of the board nodding along as she dictated the agenda. But this time was different. This time, every seat in the small clubhouse was full, and a line of people stretched along the back wall. You could feel the anticipation, the quiet undercurrent of something about to snap. I didn't plan to speak. At least, that's what I told myself. I was here to watch, to see if the rumors were true, that the board had finally started questioning Karen's leadership, that the pressure of the past few weeks had cracked the image she'd built for herself. But the moment I walked in and saw the way her eyes flicked to me, then immediately away. I knew the night was going to go somewhere she didn't want it to. The meeting started with the usual formalities, the reading of the minutes, the treasurer's report, but the room was restless. People were shifting in their seats, whispering, glancing toward the printed agenda that had new business listed halfway down the page. That was the section everyone was waiting for. When they finally got to it, Karen cleared her throat. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice carrying the same practiced authority it always had, "I'd like to address the recent events in our community. There's been a lot of misinformation circulating about the HOA, about myself, and about how we enforce our rules. I want to set the record straight." She didn't get far. A man from the back row stood up, holding a copy of her late-night email. "Is this misinformation?" he asked, his voice steady but loud enough to carry. "Because right here, you admit you don't enforce the rules equally." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's face tightened. "That was taken out of context." "It's your email," another resident interrupted, this time a woman from the front row. "You've been letting your friends break the rules while the rest of us get fined for every little thing." Karen's gaze flicked to the rest of the board, looking for support. But they weren't nodding along this time. One of them, a man named Robert who'd been on the board for nearly as long as she had, leaned into his microphone. "We've received multiple complaints, Karen, and not just about selective enforcement, about the way you've handled residents, the way you've targeted certain people." For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't have a ready answer. That's when Maria stood. She didn't look at me, didn't need to. This was her moment as much as mine. "You went after Tom for giving out water in a heat wave," she said, her voice clear and sharp. "Meanwhile, you've had an RV sitting in your backyard for years, in violation of the bylaws you claim to care so much about. How is that fair?" The room erupted. People started talking over one another, throwing out their own grievances, the wave fines for her friends, the arbitrary citations, the intimidation. It was chaos, and for once, Karen wasn't in control of it. The board president, well, technically, Karen still was the president, but you wouldn't have known it from the way Robert took charge, finally banged the gavel. "Order," he said firmly. "Given the volume of complaints, I believe we need to address this formally." Karen's head snapped toward him. "Robert," but he cut her off. "We'll be holding a special vote to determine whether you should be removed from your position as HOA president, effective immediately. Per the bylaws, a majority vote from the board is required." The silence that followed was almost painful. Karen's eyes darted from face to face, looking for someone, anyone, to back her. But the only sounds were the rustle of papers and the shifting of chairs. One by one, the board members cast their votes. When the final tally came in, 4 in favor of removal, 1 against, Karen's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood. She didn't look at anyone as she gathered her clipboard and papers, but the rigid set of her shoulders said everything. Without a word, she walked out of the clubhouse, the door slamming shut behind her. The room stayed quiet for a beat, as if everyone was making sure it had really happened. Then the applause started, hesitant at first, then louder, spreading through the room until it was impossible not to feel in your chest. I didn't join in right away. I just sat there, letting the sound wash over me, feeling the weight of the past months slowly lifting. After the meeting, people came up to me one after another. Some shook my hand, others clapped me on the back, a few just said, "Thank you," and left it at that. It wasn't about the cooler anymore. It was about the fact that someone had finally stood up to her and won. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood changed in ways I hadn't expected. The Facebook group quieted down, the constant stream of violation notices slowed to a trickle, and for the first time since I'd moved to Willow Creek, people seemed relaxed. Kids left their bikes out without fear of a citation. Someone put a small free library on their lawn, and instead of a fine, they got compliments. And when the next heat wave rolled in, it wasn't just my cooler out there. There were 3 more scattered through the neighborhood, stocked and refilled by different families. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch watching a couple of teenagers grab bottles from my cooler, Maria came by. She leaned against the railing, smiling in that knowing way of hers. "Feels different now, doesn't it?" she said. "Yeah," I said, taking a slow sip of coffee. "It does." We didn't talk about Karen much after that. She still lived in the neighborhood, though she kept to herself. I'd see her now and then, driving past in her Lexus, eyes fixed straight ahead. We didn't wave, but we didn't need to. She knew what had happened. Everyone did. The cooler stayed, and not because of any official permission or special exemption, but because it was part of the neighborhood now. Part of what made Willow Creek feel like more than just a set of houses with matching paint schemes and manicured lawns. It was a reminder that rules can be good, but people matter more. Every now and then, someone new would move in, and they'd ask about it. I'd tell them the short version, it's a long story, and then point to the bottles inside, sweating in the summer sun. But if you ever need one, I'd add, just take it. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't about winning against Karen or even about the cooler. It was about making this place a little more human. And if it took a fight to get there, well, some fights are worth having. So that's what I did. I fought. I won. And I left a cooler full of water for anyone who needed it. A small, stubborn reminder that kindness doesn't need permission.